Amado Carrillo Fuentes was an extremely powerful Mexican drug trafficker who died in mysterious circumstances in 1997. His legend, of course, lives on, and he's been portrayed in multiple film and TV incarnations. In this video, I'm going to dive into the life and times of one of the most mysterious Mexican cartel leaders, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, or perhaps better known as the Lord of the Skies. Amato came, of course, from the place where most major Mexican drug traffickers come from, Sinaloa State. The area, of course, is long known for its bandit and outlaw culture and is also home to the patron saint of bandits and narco traffickers, Jesus Malverde, who they often pray to and was seen as a sort of Robin Hood-like figure. The area is surrounded by mountains, and in fact, these mountains have long been a hideout for bandits, drug smugglers, as well as a place where both marijuana and poppies have been grown and cultivated. There is even a name for the peasants that cut the poppies and take the sap, gather it up. They're called gomeros. Much like many of the other Mexican drug traffickers, Amato came from a small town just west of Sinaloa's capital, Culiacan. He is from a small town called Guamachalito, which is a sort of very small agricultural little farm town, if you will. And he is one of 11 siblings. Despite these humble or humble-ish beginnings for Amato, he actually had a connection, an in, if you will, to the narco-trafficking business via his uncle, a bit of a narco-nepotism, if you will. His uncle was none other than Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, who initially worked as a sort of a bookkeeper and accountant for a large drug smuggling ring run by a guy called Pedro Aviles. Later, his uncle would, of course, go on to be one of the founding members of the Guadalajara cartel. But for now, Ernesto Fonseca, also known as Don Neto, gave his nephew a job at the very bottom of the drug business, cultivating marijuana in the marijuana fields. Now, as time went by, Don Neto himself became a major trafficker and founder of the Guadalajara cartel. He began to rely more and more on his nephew to help to smuggle his shipments of, weed, but then later cocaine into the United States and from further south in Mexico, just to the border area in general, and then over the border. And Amato was sent to a town called Ojinaga. Now, this town was on the border with Texas, and it was run by an old school drug smuggler, trafficker guy named Pablo Acosta, also known as Ojinaga Fox. Regardless, this became a bit of an apprenticeship for Amato to learn how to smuggle drugs and run a drug smuggling operation. And also, the town of Ojinaga was not that far from the city of Juarez, which would later loom large in Amato's legend, and one wonders if his earlier time in Ojinaga in this general area helped to familiarize himself with that major border city in Juarez. Right away, Amato proved himself to be an excellent, lieutenant. He had the requisite smarts and the ruthlessness to be able to, effectively run this type of operation. He was very quick to dispatch of anyone even suspected of having screwed up a load, informed the police, let a leak out, where some drugs were seized by the authorities. And in fact, it was sort of implied that, his boss, Pablo, actually thought that he was almost too ruthless, and that there wasn't that need to rule with such fear, but obviously Amato disagreed with this. So despite Amato and Pablo actually being quite good friends and business associates, this master and apprentice relationship, so to speak, it was never going to last forever. And one of the major problems for Pablo Acosta was that he was a massive user of cocaine, and in particular freebasing cocaine. As time went on, this really began to affect his health, his mental state. He became perhaps a little bit dissatisfied with the drug business, or sort of over it, displayed more and more erratic behavior, in particular giving a series of interviews to an American journalist, a guy called Terrence Papa, or ended up writing a book about Pablo Acosta. So many people, business associates and certain people began to really be concerned about Pablo Acosta's behavior and everything. One more small thing happens during this time when Amato is working with Pablo Acosta that kind of proves to be important later on, which is that he was returning from the United States into Mexico, and he was caught by the American authorities trying to transport an automatic weapon over the border into Mexico. The police detained him, they questioned him, they fingerprinted him, and they took his picture. This picture and these fingerprints are some of the earliest, documentation of Amato for the US authorities and just anyone in general, because he was quite a mysterious figure, or he was not given to a lot of pictures and high-profile persona. And this small arrest will come back later in our story. Around this time also, there became a big problem. Amato's uncle and the other founding members of the Guadalajara cartel, they crossed the line big time, and they killed the drug enforcement agent Kiki Camarena, and he had discovered Rafa Quintero's massive weed growing plantation. So they kidnapped him and they killed him and tortured him. And this caused a major shitstorm for all drug traffickers, that were living in Mexico at the time, operating in Mexico. Amato's uncle, Don Neto, ended up in prison over this.
Mexico's biggest drug smugglers have been busted. In previous Mexican administrations, these big-time traffickers were untouchable. But under the current president, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, some 17 significant drug smugglers are now in jail.
Amato himself actually kind of went into a little bit of an internal exile, and he left the border area and went back and worked with some contacts that he had from when he was younger. The Herrera family, which were a family they were growers and smugglers of just poppies. They actually didn't like dealing with the Colombian cartel, so they had their own business that just focused on heroin. Amato worked for them for a while. He also did a little bit with one of his brothers, a little bit of smuggling and stuff. In general, the police and the government pressure really caused a lot of problems for the Mexican drug traffickers, and it was a bit of a chaotic time. Once the heat cooled a little bit, Amato went back to Ojinaga. Pablo Acosta, was still acting erratic, still hooked on drugs, just a big mess. And eventually, Acosta was killed after a very nasty gunfight with the Mexican authorities. This left Amato basically to be the leader of this Ojinaga area. And some have speculated or said or whatever that Amato actually paid the government $1 million to go kill Pablo Acosta so that he could take over, and had also promised the government or the corrupt government officials that he would increase their profits via bribes, and he would not be so erratic and crazy as his former boss had been. During this time of his apprenticeship and learning to smuggle and everything, the thing that Amato became really known for was his use of airplanes to bring the drugs from Colombia into Mexico to be able to sort of break it down and package it and stage it before they would send it over the border into the United States. And he had all these tricks and moves that he would use using smaller airplanes, and they turned the lights off at night on the planes, and they slipped in with the normal air traffic, and they had corrupt officials, or they had their own series of makeshift airfields where they would land the drugs, and Amato became extremely effective at this. So after the death of Acosta, Amato began to assume control of this particular Ojinaga area, and it was definitely, his star was rising, and he also upped the ante when it came to smuggling the drugs from Colombia into Mexico, in that he, together with the Colombian cartels, he actually bought old jetliners, if you will, and he removed all the seats in the jetliners and filled it with cocaine so that they could have a higher yield, and bring more drugs, into Mexico and then onwards into the United States. And this is kind of where he got his name, El Señor de los Cielos, or the Lord of the Skies. Another thing that happened around this time that was not directly related to Amato, but would eventually play into his hands, was in 1989, there was a massive seizure in Sylmar, California, which is a kind of little town, city around Los Angeles, where there was a warehouse filled with 21 tons of cocaine, as well as $12 million in cash, and I'm assuming some other sort of contraband. This, I believe, remains the largest cocaine seizure in the United States. It may have been surpassed, but for a long time, this was the largest one. Really alerted the, American law enforcement as to how big and how great, the problem was, and how much product these guys had access to, and how much power they had, and blah, blah, blah. The authorities basically traced this shipment and this operation back to two guys, Rafael Aguilar and another guy called Rafael Munoz Tilvera. Now, these guys were basically in charge of the city of Juarez and that sort of border crossing, bringing drugs across there. And they had set up a pretty complex operation. And Munoz Tilvera had actually used a lot of the drug money to buy a lot of warehouses and places to store things, and a lot of restaurants and nightclubs and front businesses, and he was pretty successful and in a sense, pretty smart about diversifying himself, and was pretty successful. And Rafael Aguilar was also involved in this operation, but he was a bit more involved with the government corruption side of it, because he himself was a federal police officer, basically. And he kind of was overseeing it to make sure that the government got its cut and everything stayed calm and blah, blah, blah. But this Sylmar, California thing really caused a big stir, and both of these men actually ended up in custody.
Finalmente, las huellas digitales del detenido se comparan con las ya clasificadas en la Dirección Federal de Seguridad. Con estos elementos, se da por terminada la investigación de un crimen que pudo quedar impune.
So, now as we're getting into the 90s, Juarez itself is wide open, because there's not these two strong traffickers that were running it before are kind of waylaid with legal problems and whatnot. And Amato is a bit of a rising star. He sort of already knew the area. He had apprenticed under Pablo Acosta, and he really saw an opportunity here to make Juarez his operation. On top of that, the now imprisoned El Padrino, Jefe de Jefe, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, he actually gave Amato his blessing as well to run this corridor or plaza of Juarez. Miguel Gallardo did this from behind bars because at the time he was in prison, but was still able to run his operation via sort of cell phones and different couriers and messengers. That was kind of a final seal of approval that Juarez could be controlled by Amado Carrillo and members of his family. Now, by the early 90s, Amato had really cemented himself at the top of not just, controlling Juarez, but also controlling, becoming one of the biggest traffickers in Mexico. He had good relationships with both the Cali and the Medellin cartel. He was bringing in massive shipments, and he actually went around to the other traffickers and basically said, guys, I'll broker the large lots of cocaine coming from Colombia, and then I'll just wholesale them to you however much you want, and that's cool with me. And then he also realized the opportunity. Others had realized it before, but he kind of picked it up, which is that in the 80s, the Colombian cartel's attempts to bring drugs into the United States was very focused on this kind of Caribbean route and bringing boats and through Florida and all that. And there was a major crackdown on that. So they needed a new route to send the drugs, and that became Mexico. Initially, the Colombian traffickers kind of saw the Mexican traffickers as like, oh, these guys are just like our little errand boys. They just take the drugs and we give them a fee. But Amato and the others kind of began to see, wait a minute, no, we have more leverage in this situation, because you can make all the cocaine you want, but if you don't have the transportation and distribution, then your product sort of, sits on the shelves and rots or whatever. So he began to pressure the Colombian cartels to, earning a bigger fee, but really what he did was he asked to be paid in cocaine. He realized that he could take those bricks of cocaine, smuggle them into the United States, and create his own distribution cells where the profits would be higher because of the way in which, dealers always, they adulterate it to increase their profits, right? He had such power, Colombian drug lords basically had really no option but to sort of cede this to him in the deal, and Amato just became bigger and bigger and bigger and made more and more money. However, still, he remained a kind of an elusive figure. No one really saw him. There weren't many pictures of him. And people were at times maybe confused as to who really was running things in Juarez. Now, this isn't to say that he didn't face some problems. His old pal Aguilar eventually got out of prison and felt, I suppose, slighted that Amato was sort of acting like a big man now. Aguilar wanted his cut, but Amato felt he was, surplus to requirements. So he had Aguilar shot down in the street in Cancun, Mexico, after Aguilar was coming back from a submarine tour with his family. And he was shot to death. His wife and child were wounded in the attack, and an innocent bystander American tourist was killed as well. But this kind of dispatched Aguilar as a problem for Amato, and likely again Amato had made a deal or deals with different government officials, promising them more money or better control or whatever, so he didn't really need this protection from the cops or from this particular cop anymore. Despite the occasional bouts of violence that Amato felt were necessary, he avoided large-scale conflicts, and he would rather just make peace with the other cartels and make sure everybody made a lot of money, and so then there was no need for discontentment and shooting and bringing pressure from law enforcement and the overall costs of having a sort of gang war, drug war, because guys aren't out there selling the drugs, they're killing each other. This lesson was being played out in front of his eyes because the other cartels, two of the other cartels were in a major battle in the early 90s. The Aureliano Felix gang or family was fighting against the Sinaloa cartel and a young El Chapo. And one of the major things that happened was The Aureliano Felix family sent these gunmen to the Guadalajara airport, and they had sort of tracked El Chapo there or something like that. And they had this intel that he was driving a white Mercury Grand Marquis. And the guys, the gunmen went in there and they just raked this car with, automatic gunfire, but it was a mistake. El Chapo wasn't in the car. In fact, in the car was the sort of top cardinal from Mexico, a man named Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. In a country that is 78% Catholic, one can only imagine the outrage of the citizens when such a, important spiritual leader had been killed by these out-of-control drug traffickers acting like cowboys, shooting automatic weapons in public. This caused a lot of pressure, on the drug traffickers, in particular Aureliano Felix gang and El Chapo. This disrupted their operations. The Aureliano Felix brothers and stuff, they had to go into hiding. And on the other side, El Chapo, basically he tried to go to hiding in Guatemala, and he was arrested. And so Amato was pretty happy to avoid all of that negative attention and just keep building his empire.
¿Pero usted se dedica a las drogas? ¿A qué se dedica?
Yo soy agricultor.
¿Social?
Maíz, frijol.
Maíz y frijol.
Now, Amato's operations themselves were quite thought out, but also quite straightforward in a way. By being in Juarez, this was a major border crossing into the United States, of course, from Juarez into El Paso, Texas. El Paso in this area linked up with many of the major highway systems in the United States. So once you got across the border, you could really send the drugs anywhere you wanted, to any major or not major American city. This was really good territory, I guess. A really good plaza to be in control of. And basically, Amato took a statistical analysis type look at the business, and not that he's the first one to have done this, but this is basically how he ran his operation, using a regression analysis. So figuring out all the variables that either got the drugs through the border or got the guy stopped. And then how could they mitigate those variables or help improve the chances. So basically they would load the drugs into cars, semi-trailers, and they would hire these people to drive the cars. What was good about hiring these pasadores was they had little to no connection to really anyone in the drug business. They were just sort of poor or sort of average people, and they were just given some cash and said, drive this car across the border. If they got caught, there wasn't too much the authorities could do to get to the higher level to find out who was running this operation. On top of that, they would have these spotters at the border on the Mexican side, and they would stand by a bank of payphones, and they would monitor the agents and the border, how things were going. They would beep messages to the drivers to let them know, change lanes, be careful of a search here, anything to really make the statistical odds work more in their favor. This kind of was Amato's strategy when it came to smuggling, and I'm sure there was some corruption on both sides of the border to allow drugs through or not search this car. Once on the other side, the drugs were taken to different warehouses and cities and, broken down and chopped and changed and, spread throughout the United States. Also, Amato did use some drug tunnels to send the drugs, underneath the border. In one instance, they found it was a church in Juarez, I guess, that had been abandoned, and they dug down under the church and up on the other side into like a warehouse or something in El Paso. Amato did still try to fly some drugs in, but as it became into the 90s, the American government really cracked down on that and was good at interdicting these drug planes with their own, Air Force or law enforcement, planes.
We find it in the roofs, the floors, the door panels, behind the headlights, behind the taillights, anywhere you can imagine.
On top of that, Amato, again, using his money and a certain kind of guile, he actually purchased complex surveillance equipment and cameras, recorders, and things that could pick up things from the airwaves or whatever. And he watched the Watchers because the major drug enforcement agency sort of building or headquarters was just on the other side of the border in El Paso. And Amato was watching that building, gaining intelligence when he can as to what the US knew, what their strategies were. So really his mysterious arms were kind of everywhere. He definitely cultivated and encouraged that story or feeling, and he would send his goons, his thugs, whatever, around to threaten newspaper and newspaper writers that were going to write any articles about him. One man, in fact, actually sold his stake in the newspaper rather than having to choose between writing about Amato and being killed or willfully not reporting the news. Now, despite being at the peak of his powers, let's say, this drug business is never without problems. In 1993, a big load was captured off the Pacific coast of Mexico, and this was another method that Amato and other traffickers had employed, was they would get these fishing boats or tuna trawlers, this type of thing, and they would put the big lots of drugs on there, sort of down, in Colombia, and then they would run them up the Pacific coast until they got closer to the border, and then they would offload them and then send it over. And one of these ships got caught with a lot of cocaine on it, millions and millions of dollars worth, and the Colombian cartels were pretty upset about it. While this does happen, this is a major loss, and they're not happy about it, and as we know, when a load gets lost in this business, someone is gonna pay for it, someone's head's gonna roll. Amato was dining at this restaurant in Mexico City, fish restaurant called Bali High. As he was sitting there dining, gunmen burst into the restaurant and just started kind of spraying at his table. What happened was 2 of Amato's associates were gunned down as they got up to run away. Amato simply ducked under the table until the assault was finished, and then he sort of just, walked out of the restaurant, presumably. The reason why Amato wasn't killed in this attack was because there weren't that many pictures of him. Not that many people knew what he looked like or spent a lot of time in his company. So the assassins, they didn't know who to shoot at, or they were assuming who to shoot at. They completely missed their target, who just ducked under the table, and these other guys who tried to run away, they got killed. Again, Amato's ability to be mysterious and to not let many people know about him and know what he looked like really worked in his favor more than a few times in his sort of drug trafficking career. Now, there is also speculation that this assassination attempt didn't come from the Colombians, but it in fact came from other Mexican traffickers looking to supplant him or take over his territory or whatever. Regardless, even if it was the Cali cartel that had come after him for this loss of the big load, it didn't really matter because only a few years later, the gentlemen of Cali, the Orjuela brothers, were arrested. And they were packed off to Colombian prison. They had this whole kind of thing where they sort of got favorable treatment and blah, blah, blah. But in the end, both, if not one of them, but both of them ended up extradited to the United States, which of course, as we all know, is every South American cartel leader's worst nightmare. And it seemed, that he had diversified himself enough in terms of who he was getting the raw drugs from that a loss of one of his major suppliers was not the end of the world. Amato went down to Bolivia and was getting the raw cocaine paste and then having it produced into the powder and so on and so forth, and then bringing it up. So he was expanding the business, the different segments of the business. He was starting to gather them up, if you will. Now, the fact that he was the leader of this, well-humming drug operation gave him an immense amount of profit. And he became, people sort of said, the richest man in Mexico with a net worth of 25 billion. Now, I mean, I don't know about these numbers, but I guess so. At the time, he sort of far surpassed the legitimate richest man in Mexico, who later would become one of the richest men in the world, Carlos Slim, who was in the oil business and also telecommunications. Regardless, Carlos Slim's net worth was a paltry 8 billion compared to Amato's. He began to buy houses and build his own house, including a mansion that he made in the suburbs of Juarez, which ended up being unfinished, but he made it look like an Arabian palace with those sort of domed roofs and stuff like that, and it became sort of known in the area as like the Palace of 1,000 Arabian Nights or 101 Arabian Nights, whatever that Arabian Nights saying is. He sent his children to private schools in Switzerland, and he sort of had like a kind of two families, if you will. He had been married once and had a couple children, and then he had a couple children with a sort of mistress that we know of. And he also began to engage in a bit of narco-populism, which is common among these guys, being that Robin Hood figure that he wanted to be seen as. He went back to the town of Guamacholito, where he's from, and he built a church. He built some basketball courts for the local children.
No, pues él todo el tiempo se hablaba que él era muy bueno con toda la gente.
¿Qué hizo aquí, por ejemplo, en este lugar?
Pues él lo único obra que hizo buena fue la iglesia.
So, despite Amato's disappearing act, the American DEA was not fooled, and they had enough intelligence and rumors and informants, I guess, to let them know that Amato was really running things down in Mexico, and they wanted to catch him, and they sort of knew that they would have to turn up the heat because he had a lot of political protection and loyalty from the population, and he was really hard to pin down and to catch. He said during this time that he had purchased a tiger, a common drug lord cliche, and that the tiger had actually escaped and ran around the streets of Juarez before it was captured by animal control and taken to the Juarez Zoo. This isn't to say that Amato didn't have to enforce, his rule of law, if you will, in Juarez at the time, killing rival traffickers or anybody that caused trouble. A lot of that was taken care of by his brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, who handled that sort of dirty work. They also called him the Viceroy. And this was all around the time, too, where there was sort of that NAFTA free trade agreement, and Mexico was trying to, all right, we want to do business with America thing, and America was pressuring Mexico to stop these drug traffickers. So there was a sort of a new task force or something, a new initiative to catch Amato, and they put in charge a general called Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, and he was sort of seen as the top man in the military, but sort of doing this policing work of catching Amato and other drug lords as well. Rebollo, he met with the top drug, czar or government official from the United States, and they had this meeting, and it was also great. And Barry McCaffrey, the guy who was the drug czar, said that this guy was a man of impeccable, integrity and character. And
we have begun the serious exchange of sensitive intelligence related to drug criminal organizations.
However, this was just a big show for the Americans because Rebollo had long been on Amato's payroll and was tipping him off about attempts to capture him or attempts to stop his loads and attempts to stop his cocaine, from making it into Mexico or into America, and this was all kind of laughable. Rebollo was caught because he had been living in this sort of chic apartment in a nice neighborhood of Mexico City that, presumably the rent or the whatever mortgage of this apartment would be far beyond what even a top general in the Mexican army or government official would make per year for salary. He was arrested, and this was a major embarrassment for both Mexico and the United States. Of course, I'm sure a big hit for Amato, who, again, I'm sure he probably had multiple guys on his payroll telling him, what was coming.
I think that the American people should have two reactions. First of all, that this is a very serious revelation and deeply troubling. Secondly, the fact that we should be encouraged by President Zedillo's determination, because the government has taken this action. The president has personally taken this action, and they've made it public. And they're obviously saying to the world and to the people of Mexico, we will not tolerate corruption if we can find it and root it out, even if it's at the highest level.
Now, this led to another attempt to capture Amato. So while Amato was feeling this pressure from the government, it was not all bad. And his sister was getting married in the small town where Amato was from, and Amato, of course, was not going to miss his sister's wedding. So Amato flew down to Sinaloa to see his sister, and I believe they sort of had this, there was like a family compound. Now I'm sure Amato helped to pay for that. And they were having the ceremony and all that stuff. What they didn't know was the priest who actually married Amato's sister was a police informant, or had tipped off the police that Amato would definitely be there. The army prepared to sort of, raid the wedding. There is actually some video of Amato at the wedding, and sort of, he's sort of glad-handing with guests and sort of beaming with pride at his sister being married. Just after this video was taken, the Mexican authorities burst in and tried to capture Amato. But at the very last minute, Amato had received a tip-off from someone that they were coming for him, and he left. He got into an old sort of, I guess, beat-up farmer's pickup truck or whatever, and drove the truck out of town. The army had even set up checkpoints on the way in and out of town, and he was stopped by the checkpoint, but was able to pass himself off as a simple peasant farmer, got through and got away. Now, what happened to the priest that tipped off the authorities to this? Well, a few days later at the local army barracks, they received a delivery in a cardboard box, and when they opened it up, the priest's head rolled out. This raid incensed Amato, not just because the priest had tipped him off, but Amato felt kind of betrayed that he had paid all these bribes to the government, and here he was being harassed by law enforcement. On top of that, there was perhaps this sense that Amato was getting sick of the pressure of looking over his shoulder. He'd made so much money that one would assume or speculate kind of just wanted to take care of himself and his family and live a relatively peaceful life. There is rumor that he sent a message to the president of Mexico saying, if you leave me alone, I will make sure that no of these drugs are sold in the country and in the areas I control, and I'll continue to put my money, my profits, back into the country of Mexico, which presumably would be helpful for the economy, and so on and so forth. There's even a rumor that I once heard that Amato offered to pay off the national debt of Mexico, something like that. Of course, this deal was not really honored, and the authorities kind of kept coming after Amato, and Amato was leaning towards this. Maybe people speculated that he was going to try and just disappear for good and go and live out his life in a mansion down in, Chile or Argentina or who knows where. So now we arrive at perhaps the most creepiest, weirdest, mysterious part of Amato's story. Feeling the pressure, Amato went to a tried and true strategy that supposedly he had used before, which is getting plastic surgery. People, many law enforcement, different people have speculated that throughout his career, when he had been captured by the police, his appearance often looked different. He looked at times he looked like thinner, he looked like his face had changed. In fact, the comparison between his picture when he was first arrested back in the 80s on the border and another arrest where he had been arrested at an airport bringing his cocaine in, that these pictures looked totally different. There was many faces to Amato, and some of that said it became because he was a user of plastic surgery as a way to avoid detection. So Amato checked himself into this clinic in Mexico City. It was a sort of very nice private clinic in a very nice area of Mexico City. He was going to get some kind of a facial reconstructive surgery, and he was going to get more liposuction. This is not what ended up happening. But he checked in under an assumed name. He made it so that his bodyguards would be inside the room while the operation was going on. During the surgery, Amato died. They said that it had to do with the anesthesia that he was given and how it interacted with his heart and his certain, underlying medical conditions, and that's why he passed away. Many people have said it's because, like his old pal Pablo Acosta, Amato was a big freebaser and user of cocaine, and that his heart was, damaged or weakened by years of cocaine abuse, and this anesthesia was the last straw. Others have said that he was deliberately given an overdose of this medication so that he would die. Some said that he was smothered by someone in there who wanted to see him dead. And others still speculate that this was all a big stunt and that Amato escaped, faked his own death, and again, is living on a beach in South America somewhere. The Mexican authorities and I guess the press, they held this, I don't know what you want to call it, press conference, I guess, pretty grisly press conference, where they showed the body of Amato. His face looks so creepy, like a skeleton or like a monster, and it's all bruised and weird, and it's really weird and creepy. They were basically saying, this is Amato, he's dead. There was a lot of belief in his, uncatchability and being this omniscient guy, that he wasn't dead, this wasn't him, and that he had somehow done some elaborate scheme. Meanwhile, the DEA had their own interest in proving that this was Amato or disproving that it was Amato. They had those fingerprints from his first arrest way back when, and they went and saw the body and proved that it was Amado.
Fuentes. La Procuraduría reitera lo que ha señalado en sus boletines anteriores y no habrá ninguna otra declaración más la que ratificar que una vez terminadas las diligencias y teniendo la certeza al 100%, se dará a conocer lo conducente. Muchas gracias.
Again, there's still doubts, I guess. His family showed up. Some of them were initially, it's not my son, blah, 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 but eventually I guess that was sort of accepted. They flew him back to Guamachalito, where he's from. And they had an elaborate funeral for him. He's entombed in one of those ostentatious Mexican drug lord mausoleums with a TV and air conditioning and a refrigerator. And by the way, Amato's grave is literally listed on Google Maps. So this is ultimately the end of Amato. Following Amato's death, his brother, Vicente, was left to control the operation. It's heavily speculated, although not proven. He captured the doctors that were at this surgery where Amato died, and he tortured them, killed them, chopped them up, and put them into oil drums and left them on the side of the road, basically. Again, as a reminder not to cross any of these, the Carrillo Fuentes family, and I'm sure some kind of an angry, reprisal. Vicente kept running the family, or the organization, if you will. There was some skirmishes in the immediate death of Amato. Certain people were attacked and shot up some restaurants and stuff, but more or less things kind of, I guess, calmed down, and the family still has some interest. Eventually, Vicente was captured in Mexico and actually was just recently extradited to the United States. Also, Amato's son took on some role in the business until he was captured going for a jog in a nice area of Mexico City. His name was Vicente as well. So obviously his legend is huge in Mexico and around the world, and he's been portrayed in multiple sort of TV, and movie incarnations and things like Narcos. But I personally find the best portrayal of him from the 2000 movie Traffic, which is a sort of fictionalized reality, but within the film there's a character called Porfirio Madrigal, and there's a scene where Michael Douglas's character goes to the border, and the sort of drug agent shows him, look through the binoculars, and right on the other side of the border, they see this sort of big house, and he says that's the house of Porfirio Madrigal, is a nod to Amato's mansion that he had built.
That house you're looking at over there used to belong to Porfirio Madrigal. His nickname was Scorpion. I'll let you figure out what that means.
Wasn't that the guy who died during plastic surgery?
Best of our information, yes.
Also, then he says something along the lines of, and he was the one that was recently killed during plastic surgery. Yes, this is a nod to Amato's plastic surgery. And later we see that the Porfirio Madrigal character is still alive, but with these sort of bandages on his face like he'd had plastic surgery. And I guess this was sort of playing off the idea of Amato using this as a trick to fake his own death. The film also took inspiration from Amato's relationship with Gutierrez Rebollo in the creation of the character General Salazar. And something about the portrayal in that movie makes it feel much more real and much more how the story of Amado Carrillo Fuentes always felt to me. In other shows like Narcos, which I love, it's portrayed in a little bit more sexy way. I think that Traffic and the real life story is a little bit more mysterious and grim and kind of creepy, honestly. It's a tale of this guy that had immense wealth and power, but ended up, I guess, in a kind of a gilded prison, and I imagine that his final months and weeks of his life were probably pretty dire, and he felt pretty, paranoid and strung out on cocaine and moving from house to house without any of them really being a home. And, despite his money and his power and everything, he was unable to fix his problems and died in this kind of creepy last-ditch effort to avoid, being caught by getting this plastic surgery, and the idea that perhaps all the money and power he had accrued was not enough to run away from his problems and avoid the truth of the situation of his life and that had been created, And that's my video on Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the most, I think, mysterious, creepiest, weirdest drug trafficker of all time.
Llamado Amado Carrillo, de negra, verde y de blanca, a medio mundo tapaba. Por esto es que hasta los gringos hacía tiempo le temblaban. Saber que un día falleciera era lo que le deseaban.